My name is Daniel McNeil. I'm the Q&S Chair in Black Studies and delighted to welcome you to this first meeting of the Black Studies Reading Group. Thanks so much for logging in, and special thanks to Abdul for carving out time to join us to discuss his history of Black Studies. I'm speaking from the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit, and some of us on the Zoom call are gathered in the welcoming room, a newly designed communal space, an Indigenous classroom at Queen's, which is situated on the traditional Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory. And as we discuss Abdul's work around singular and collective struggles against anti-Black racism in the US, it's important to address that many of us are logging in from spaces in which white supremacy and settler colonial racism has dispossessed the Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island, and that many Indigenous scholars and Indigenous-led movements have engaged with Black thinkers and activists to contest the ongoing dispossession of land. As Richard Eiton, Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, and many other Black, Indigenous, and decolonial scholars, activists, and creatives have reminded us and articulated with such insight, imagination, and wisdom, it's critical to develop strategies to make legible, audible, and visible some of the discourses and practices of modernity and coloniality that, when struggled against in isolation, cannot be recognized, contested, and transcended. I'm also really appreciating Milka's reminder about the revolutionary power of curiosity, and how that informs our work, and how it's informed Abdul's work as a founder of the field of Black Studies and author of many books and papers about Black liberation. I'll just post in the chat a link to his website, where there's a reminder not just about the texts that he's published, but also how many of them are free and available online. A lifelong scholar activist with a PhD from the University of Chicago, he's lectured, taught, and directed academic programs across the US, the Caribbean, Africa, Europe, and China. And I think this is critical for us today, and how we're thinking about a program where we explore the complexities of global Black studies. Just to echo my colleagues, I'm so grateful that you've taken the time to join us this afternoon, Abdul. So much of what you've done in this text speaks to the work we're doing and hope to do to build a Black Studies program that addresses decolonial praxis and interdisciplinary studies of liberation. On a personal level, when I read the book, I was struck by how you address the specificities of US institutions while also engaging with the Caribbean and African diasporic scholars, such as C.L.R. James, W. Arthur Lewis, who lived in the US and or influenced American politics, culture, and society. I was also stimulated by how you were recording the intellectual aspirations and achievements of African Americans, such as Anna Julia Cooper and St. Clair Drake, who studied in the Caribbean, Africa, and Europe, as well as in Turtle Island. It's also an immense pleasure to read a book that spends so much time and spends such diligent attention, careful attention to mentorship and institution building, thinking about how we can get together inside and outside of conventional politics to change things, how we can draw connections between the histories you share about student protests at Atlanta University that you participated in the late 1960s, and the largest student occupation in Canadian history in Sir Jones Williams University, now Concordia University, in 1969. And lastly, I'd just like to say how thankful I am for the book's commitment to struggles for political legitimacy in bookstores, in libraries, in concert stages, in carnivals, as well as in seminar rooms and university boardrooms. And really looking forward to thinking with you, planning, conspiring, and dreaming about interdisciplinary, creative, and collaborative knowledge making within, outside, and beyond the university. Yeah, so without any further ado, I'll pass it on to you and make sure that you can share your screen as well.
Is my screen, my slides visible? Okay, great.
Yes.
Okay, well, first of all, let me just say what a pleasure it is to have this opportunity. You know, you write a book and you wonder, is anybody going to read it? And so I'm just so very pleased that we can have this conversation. This slide is just some of the texts that I've done that speak to Black studies as it has historically developed. I do want to mention the book, The Future of Black Studies, will be out in July. And some of the concerns that have been raised are dealt with in that particular text, particularly a selection of on the African diaspora, which deals with 11 countries, their experience in studying the Black experience. So maybe in the discussion later, we'll have something to say about that. But these texts really are an attempt to sum up a history that is in motion. And that we stress the Sankofa principle of going back and looking at the past in order to chart our path to the future. I want to start by reviewing the definition, the conceptual framework that I was working with that you note is listed at the very front of the book. That Black Studies includes those activities that study and teach about African Americans, including Africans and other African descendant people, where Black people themselves are the main agents or protagonists of study and learning, not exclusively, but primarily, that counter racism and contribute to human liberation, that celebrate the Black experience. Cultural celebration is an important part of how we know and perform ourselves. And Black Studies presents an analysis of the economies, cultures, and politics of the American hemisphere and Western Europe from the perspective of people of African descent. The bottom line here is the fundamental tenet of racism is to deny Black people reason. And what Black Studies demonstrates in all its many manifestations is that Black people have always been reasonable. In fact, I would say too damn reasonable in many instances. So the basic framework of the book, as you know, looks at these three different ways in which Black Studies has historically developed: as intellectual history, as social movement, and as academic profession. Now, in terms of intellectual history, we deal with three different ways to think about that. The first way is that because of segregation and the limited access to resources, the development of the PhD, you know, sort of in the mainstream sense, the leading degree for entering an academic profession of professional scholars, Black individuals went to the mainstream institutions to achieve that. And as you can look in the book, you can see the way in which I attempt to look at not only the first PhD in the professions listed there, I think 15 or so disciplines. There's also the way in which those historical disciplines developed. Now, first of all, the whole question of disciplines is a serious question we have to interrogate. What does it mean to have a discipline? I, for example, was trained in sociology, but you know, what's the relationship between somebody in small groups, social psychology, or linguist, and a demographer? Different sets of data, different methodologies, et cetera. Same is true in anthropology or an English department, where some people are looking at film and some people are looking at poems on a piece of paper. So these historic disciplines are a question. And what Black Studies has done is exploded that definition, helping people to read across disciplines, because the topic is the Black experience. The Black experience comes in all its complexity, and therefore no one discipline has access to truth about that experience. In any case, in addition to mainstream institutions, historically Black colleges and universities developed, and we deal with Howard, Fisk, and Atlanta universities as really the context for a great debate, which I'll get to in just a moment. And then, of course, in the community, this, of course, raises the whole class question of knowledge production and audience for that knowledge. And so it's really important that even high schools are mentioned, because in the Black community, many of the people who graduated with advanced degrees because of segregation did not get jobs in higher education. They went to teach in high schools. And those high schools became really cauldrons of intellectual ferment, intellectual development. But in addition to that, the bookstores, the libraries, the museums, the cultural centers, all of these were institutions of knowledge productions and institutions of memory. That's very important, this question of memory, both transgenerational oral history, as well as the accumulation of archives and documents. Now, the debate that I was talking about in terms of the HBCUs really had to do with Eurocentrism, because the HBCUs were initially created based on models of the mainstream higher education. So the classics of Greece and Rome really were foundational to the curriculum. So here you see the 1920s example that existed at Fisk University. At Howard University, you had to take 4 years of Greek and 3 years of Latin. This was the foundation. This was the measure of what it meant to be a scholar. But that's not what continued to be true at the HBCU. So in the 1940s, by the 1940s, there was a shift in moving toward the study of the Black experience. In this case, the first African-American curriculum in higher education was developed at Fisk University in 1943. Now, the normative narrative is that Black studies, African studies in 1948 by the anthropologist Melville Herskovits, when in fact, it began at Fisk 5 years earlier by Mark Hanna Watkins, a linguist who had gotten his PhD at the University of Chicago, studying with Edwin Sapir and others. Based on this constant focus on knowledge production in the historic sense, it's very important to talk about the movements that developed essentially post-World War II, but mainly in the 1960s forward. The freedom movement was really the way in which the McCarthy period was broken. As you may know, the McCarthy period was a right-wing anti-communist scare movement that really put a pause on progressive thinking and acting in the United States. After the Brown versus Board decision to integrate schools in 1954, 1955, a great deal of motion was created. And the freedom movement developed. A great leap occurred in 1959, 1960 with the sit-ins. So this was the emergence of a new generation. In fact, if you think about it, the generation that experienced school integration based on the Brown decision of 1954 was the very generation that later created the sit-in movement in 1959, 1960. And so the freedom movement created what I call an emergent institution, that is the freedom schools. And what has happened is that there's sort of the political culture of struggle every time a movement breaks out. So for example, a school boycott or any kind of sustained movement, a freedom school emerges so that churches, community centers, people's homes suddenly become centers of schooling to bring forward a freedom agenda. But the big breakthrough was in 1966 with Black Power. And so the Black Power movement really was that paradigm shift that we were talking about earlier. That is to say, before Black Power, the essential model of civil rights had replaced the freedom struggle. See, Black people had always talked about the freedom struggle, but that was replaced by civil rights, which places the freedom struggle within the context of mainstream politics. That is to say, that progress was through passing legislation, electing people to office, et cetera. So civil rights movement. And the civil rights movement required allies and required meeting the standards of the mainstream. In other words, how do you get past the gatekeepers? And what Black Power did is it shifted the paradigm. It shifted it to suddenly now the community becomes your target audience. Self-reliance replaces the necessary allies of the mainstream. And you begin to talk about how aggregating your resources then gives you a power base to impose your will to change the society. And so the Black Power movement then had its many manifestations in the Black Arts movement, in the new communist movement, where working class people began to assert themselves. The struggle of Black workers in Detroit, for example, broke the impasse of struggle on the factory floor since the 1930s and 40s. And of course, the Black women's movement and the Black student movement. One of the great institutions that developed out of the Black Power movement was Malcolm X Liberation University, which was an emergent institution that developed as a result of the student struggle at Duke University in North Carolina. And on this picture, you can see Howard Fuller, who became Owosu Sadoki, sitting next to Chuck Hopkins, who was a student leader from Duke University. But it's also important to mention that this Black Power paradigm shift was global in its implication, as I'm sure everybody knows. So for example, the Black Power movement impacted the Caribbean. And here you can see Walter Rodney, one of the great scholar activists from Guyana, who was in the tradition really of intellectual activists from the Caribbean, had experiences in the United States and in England, as well as obviously the Caribbean, his home region. Also impacted South Africa. Here you see a picture of the South African movement and Stephen Biko, the leader of the Black consciousness movement. And of course, London. Here you see a picture of the Black Panther movement in London, and you see a picture of Darcus Howe, who was one of the leaders of Race Today, an important publication that was based in London. Now, the Black Arts movement really was the movement of the artist. Every art genre became involved. And it was really interesting because people organized themselves, even painters, dramatists, poets, musicians began to organize. Now, what's interesting is the first point of organization was political. They came together because of the post-March on Washington, the post-Black Power period. And so everybody had been facing a mainstream that was inhospitable to their work. And so organizing themselves for self-reliance and then imposing that will on these institutions to force the museums, the libraries, the galleries to change. This is what happened. And what's interesting is these social movements, everything they did, suddenly become the curriculum for Black studies later. So it's not only the knowledge that was produced, but their actual experience becomes part of the necessary material for the curriculum. And here in this picture, you see the picture of Imamu Baraka, Leroy Jones at that point, and Larry Neal. And really, I want to say Larry Neal is probably the most important theoretician of the Black arts movement. So those of you who are not familiar with his work would really gain a lot by investigating Larry Neal. Here you see a picture of Barbara Ann Teer and the founding of the National Black Theater in New York, but also an example of the journals. So here's Black Theater, which is a journal that focused on Black theater, but there were journals that focused on almost every art form. Some of them lasted for a short time, some for a long time, but as a group, as an aggregate, it really reflects a renaissance, an explosion of intellectual and artistic production. I want to show this picture. This is the Wall of Respect in Chicago that we created in 1967. Aretha Franklin's tune Respect had come out earlier that summer, and that was adopted as the name of this wall. Now, what's interesting is that this wall was created by bringing individual artists out of their individual studio spaces to come together to agree on taking a wall in an area that we used to call the forbidden zone, lower income, gang-dominated area in the Black community of the South Side of Chicago. And this was an attempt to, talking about, again, the paradigm shift from the individual gallery and artist studio to a public wall to free art in the context of a community that was not a legitimized audience for this artist. This was not supposed to be their aspiration. And their aspiration became Black people themselves, especially Black people who had been marginalized. And what's really interesting about this is the people who lived across the street called the artist over and said, look, I have to look at this every day. And they expressed their own aesthetic concerns for what the art should be like. And suddenly the artist had a conversation about aesthetics with people, and they had to translate their sense of aesthetics in the language of the people, and then get back up on the wall and change it so that it became part of the community. It was transformative. The engagement was transformative, and there's a lesson in that for Black studies in general. And of course, the musicians. Obviously, music is the foundation of our cultural development. And one of the interesting things about the musicians is that they had a global consciousness. As you can see here, the Art Ensemble of Chicago had a real deeper understanding of how the music was really part of our martial music. Like the sister, Margaret Walker, said, let the martial songs be written, let the dirges disappear. These brothers put on war paint. Now, moving from the Black Studies intellectual history, Black Studies social movements, now talking about Black Studies academic profession. Now, the Black student movement was an interesting development after the assassination of Martin Luther King. Before entering into this period, there were less than a million, less than 100,000 Black college students. And eventually, after the 60s, it was over 1 million. So what we have here is a time when there was a giant enrollment of Black students in mainstream higher education without any preparation at all. And therefore, there was a confrontation with institutional racism, because these were mainly Black students who were not from college-educated families. So they were upwardly mobile in that sense, but they were also bringing with them the ideological and political orientation of Black power. And so when they hit the campus and found institutional racism, struggle emerged. And this was really the basis for a institutional conflict that even ran counter to Black people who had been able to get into these institutions single file, so to speak. So there were a few there. And so there was conflict. So it was almost like a conflict in language. The Negroes who were inside and had achieved and really should have been and were to some extent applauded, had to confront mad and angry young Black students who were being disrespected by the institution because they were failing to conform. So we look at these 6 different stages of development. Every institution has its own particular history, but I found that each of these were stages that had been passed through on most campuses. So social disruption, building takeovers, confrontation took place, sometimes in individual classrooms. But then there had to be a building of consensus, a discussion of what was meant by Black studies. I mean, I remember once we were in a boardroom and we were demanding Black studies, and some people said, well, what do you want? And we basically said, what do you have? And they said, well, we have sociology. And we said, we want Black sociology. They said, well, we have English. We want Black English. Then when we left that meeting, we looked to each other and we said, well, what does that mean? You know, what are we talking about? And so that sent us to the library, to archives, that sent us to historical studies, that sent us to elders who were prepared to talk to us, like St. Clair Drake and others. So we had to discover what it is we wanted, but we knew what we didn't want. And so we then had to rediscover. And so that consensus became a very important debate that occurred many different ways: institutional debates, conferences, journals, et cetera. Now, the question of institution building is very important because we all knew that tenured professorships, departments with the budgets that were more stable than out of the best wishes of an administrator that could be counted upon, was our goal. But in the process, every institution had its own way of dealing with innovation. And so institutes, centers, programs, commissions, were all forms that were taken. But historically, we now can see that no matter where it started, the historical process is toward formal departmental status with tenure track appointments with an established budget. And then, of course, the question of the profession. And here, of course, what we're talking about is the PhD degree, professional organizations, so that peer review becomes an important aspect of self-reliance, and journals, where, again, peer review become the basis for establishing a professional literature, which then is a precondition for our historical development of curriculum. Now, at the level of theory, one of the interesting things that happened in the development of Black studies is that academic freedom became an asset and a liability. Academic freedom as an asset meant that each of us is free, relatively speaking, in our classrooms and in our research and writing to find topics that are of interest to us and that we can pursue, sometimes for the length of an entire career, depending on the questions we're raising and how we're approaching. But it becomes a liability if the individualism of that academic freedom takes the place of any collective sense of mission and purpose, not only within the campus, but within the Black studies as a whole. So, for example, the whole question of standardization of curriculum. What does a course called Introduction to Black Studies what is that course? Is it the same in every campus, or does every campus have their own version? And then also, and most importantly, is this question of what is the relationship between our theoretical understanding and the consciousness of Black people more generally? Well, I've tried to look at the theory of in Black studies in two different ways. One way is what is called Afrocentricity. That is the critique of Eurocentrism, then posits a different historical origin by looking at Egypt and looking at a historical development of ideas and culture that has its origin there. And one then has questions about the continuity of thought, which also then obviously means the discontinuity or the divergence of thought. That as compared to what I'm calling Black experientialism. That is to say, the focus that begins by focusing on the actual experience that we're looking at in any given historical period and starting from there, and then working backwards or working comparatively. I'm sure we could talk about that. And then, of course, the norming of research. Here's where I think this whole question of our collective understanding of our mission, hopefully we will fulfill it and not betray it. And so we have, for example, the form of knowledge called collective works. You know, so if you take somebody like Carter G. Woodson, or you take somebody like St. Clair Drake, or somebody like C.L.R. James, what is their the availability of all of their intellectual production? So that's an important agenda item for us. Every major thinker, every major school of thought, all of their work needs to be aggregated. Then we also have the question of the consciousness of Black people relative to a common experience. We have the example of the slave narratives in the United States, and of course, it's ongoing in terms of the entire world. What did people who experienced slavery say in terms of their memory of that experience? And do we have that knowledge? With all the problems with it methodologically, that is what we have. And so, for example, from my point of view, every institution's experience with regard to Black studies should be the subject of research and publication. We've started that to some extent, but if there are 300 to 400 institutions, we should have a history of each one of those programs. The struggle that took place, what was the historical development of the curriculum? All of those things need to be looked upon, because otherwise we won't have that knowledge. And right now in the United States, the people who were the initial founders are making their transition. So it's urgent that this be an issue that is raised. Now, in terms of the future of Black studies, one of my arguments is exactly this point, that the future is going to be a global future based on Black studies having a big development in the diaspora. That includes Canada, by the way. And so I'm so very glad that we're having this discussion. But so that's one point, the diaspora. The second point is that information technology is going to have a great impact. It's having a big impact. I mean, after all, we're on Zoom right now. So Zoom is going to become a part of our normal behavior. And obviously that means that we can now have global discourse as we're having today. And when I taught in Berlin at the John F. Kennedy Institute, I had to go there to do it. And here we have a sister sitting in Switzerland who did her work in Berlin, or no, in Frankfurt, and we're in conversation. So, but this gives you some idea of again how I think the normative organization of Black studies will benefit from this information technology. So what I've tried to do is just make a few comments quickly about Black Studies as intellectual history, Black Studies as social movement, and Black Studies as academic profession. And I'm anxiously awaiting your comments and questions.
Thanks so much, Abdul. I'll open up the floor. If folks would like to share questions either in the chat or through audio. I'm also going to put in one of Lewis Gordon's works that you reminded me of about Black intellectual traditions in the chat. Catherine.
Oh, thank you so much. That was a clinic. So thank you for that. And it's much appreciated. Just so much everything, all goodness. One of the things that struck me, so I've been thinking about this in a few ways. Like I've been thinking about it in terms of how to think about the creative, how to think about the cultural production or creative works in relation to the institutionalization of Black studies. And so the graffiti on the wall is the example where it's the example that you gave us where there was a conversation about what that should look like because who has to see this. And so I'm thinking as well about kind of the complexities of, for example, music and music making, hip hop, visual arts, photography, and so on and so forth, and how those are kind of how those get produced in a university context and kind of disciplined in a way that you wouldn't see on that wall, right? That wouldn't happen in the university context. And I wonder what your thoughts are. Can you talk a little bit more about, in addition to the Black arts movement, like how we might think about cultural production as part of this Black studies story, but that is part of the university story, but also can't be part of it, or maybe can't be contained by it.
Yeah, I think a lot of this is really about audience, because when we talk about the university being conservative or being forcing people into what traditions that are upheld in the university, you're really talking about the audience that then rewards you. Whether you're in a class, you're rewarded with grades, whether you're tenure track, you're rewarded with tenure or a promotion, et cetera, that sort of thing. And it seems to me that there is an inevitability to certain aspects of that institutional dynamic. I mean, obviously one struggles, Diop didn't get his PhD, and he had to write another PhD and eventually he got it. But I mean, it was, a struggle. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, this audience, this question of the Black community and having the Black community as an audience is really fundamental. Now, the project at Brown University that was developed called Rights to Reason, what they did was the Black Studies scholars worked in their respective ways, and then they published and pursued their professional audience, but they also then were asked to reconfigure their work in a theatrical context and present it to the community. So you always have these two dialogues going on. On the one hand, you're speaking to scholars. On the other hand, you're speaking to the people in the Black community. And I think, for example, that there are artists, intellectuals, who sometimes need to be disciplined by the community. In other words, some people think they can just invent what Black means. and they haven't checked with any Black people, it comes out of their head, you know. I mean, if you're interested in the Black aesthetic, just go out and look and you see what people are wearing. This brother might have 2 or 3 different plaids on, etc. Maybe you need to think about that. I mean, Black people are alive, and that's what we're dealing with. Real human beings, real communities. And so anyway, audience is fundamental. And sometimes we need to be reminded of that because, sometimes in the university, people get the big head, I mean, after all, we are the intellectuals, we're Professor so-and-so. And we forget that there are smart and wise people in the Black community. One of the projects we did was we discovered people study the community. Then they write it up and they put it in the library. But the community never finds out what they found out. So we had a project where we essentially surveyed all of that, summed it up, and then we called 100 people from the community together. We called them difference makers. And we gave each one a copy of all of this and had a conversation. In other words, trying to now redefine the relationship between the community and the university, which not only means that the community needs to read what this is because it's useful, but it also means we have to change the university's understanding that they're doing this for a purpose. Now, the University of Illinois is a land grant institution. That was institutions that were set up to work with farmers and business people to improve the economy of the United States. We use that model for Black studies. In other words, we have Black studies because our community needs us to provide the intellectual tools necessary to transform the society and the conditions under which they live. That means the university has to change.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, beautiful.
Thanks. I see Vanessa also has a hand up and Terry, so we'll maybe go to Vanessa first. And I think the comments also speak to a conversation Vanessa and I had about C.L.R. James, and he's reminded that ordinary people do not need an intellectual vanguard to tell them how to think or what to say. And I think the other thing that really stands out in your text is the subtext of challenging exaggerated individualism of so-called public intellectuals who are entrepreneurial intellectuals speaking to a particular audience of the New Yorker liberal weeklies, monthlies, etc., but not other audiences. So maybe we can take a reflection, comment, questions from Vanessa and then Terry. Thanks again.
Thank you so much. This is everything. And I have so many questions, but I obviously have to limit them. It's just so wonderful listening to you. It's super inspiring. And I love the kind of also commitment to the direction towards popular universities and to like going back and forth in terms of Black communities to also not just individualized knowledge production, but to engage with it collectively and also to show that vulnerability as scholars to say, okay, what do you actually think about this research, that we not just study the Black community, but engage with our communities. One question, so I will try to keep it short. It's actually a threefold question, I think. And one is a dear Black feminist and anti-imperialist, her name is Françoise Vergès. She usually, like what I learned from her is in terms of the question of the past and the future. She comes from La Réunion, and she actually taught me that we cannot see the future, we can only imagine it because it's behind us. But what is before us is actually the past and the present, and we can like see it in front of us. and can engage with it. And with that thought, I was thinking of, if you would look back in terms of the development of Black studies, the institution, the kind of history, the legacy of Black studies, what were maybe some of the pitfalls now looking back? And I'm asking that question because I think now at the stage we see the universities at, in terms of neoliberal racial capitalism and the economization, further economization of education, but also the kind of deepening of class relations within the Black communities, globally speaking. I'm wondering, would you say there was also a moment where actually the state crushed and de-radicalized movements with that institutionalization? And what can we actually learn from that by moving forward? And the other two questions I had is, one is time, and this relates also to the neoliberalization of the university, right? That for certain things, like, I mean, I'm an assistant professor now. I finished my PhD 2017, and I already see the kind of time shrinking within doing even activist scholarship and participatory action research. Like for my PhD, I went back to the movements, I provided summaries, we had time to discuss. But now when I'm thinking of broader projects, I'm thinking like, where's the time? How can I like seize the time? How can we seize the time within the university? Because it gets like minor and minor, lesser and lesser. And then the third issue is language, because I think in terms of the global dimension of Black studies, so much translation work or reorientation work needs to be done that I think, and I also learned from the past here, because a lot of these journals you are referring to, or even the UNIA by Garvey or whatever, right? I mean, these were global kind of outreaches too. So the question of language must have played a role there. So I'm wondering also with regards to moving forward with Black studies and the global Black studies, or the institutionalization of global Black studies in parts of the global Black diaspora, what role does language play in there, and our the necessity to connect via language, and that of course also means to connect via the local but also the global context.
Well, thank you for such interesting questions and comments. One of the very important points to keep in mind is that the ruling class intends to rule forever. And that means that they have institutional processes at work that help them accomplish that. And so bureaucratization is really a very profound process. It operates without anybody manipulating. It just is a machine that works. And so the other aspect, of course, is the intentional use of resources to control and manipulate in ways that we've just begun to scratch the surface. I mean, if you think about the role of the CIA in this country in the creation of, in quotes, American studies throughout the world, Berlin would be a very good place to think about such activity, America House. But also around the world. In other words, what was surprising to many African scholars and Caribbean scholars is to discover that their conferences, their journals, et cetera, were funded by the CIA. So yeah, we're up against it, you know, whether or not it's the general processes or whether it's the intentionality of the state to suppress resistance and development of a more progressive agenda. But what we have is the objective reality that Black people are exploited and oppressed. And therefore, out of that objectivity will come spontaneity. It can't control that. It's almost like our cultural production. You know what I mean? Who knows what the next music and what the next dance is going to be like? You know what I mean? I don't know where it comes from. I don't know if anybody here knows where it comes, but we know it's coming. It can't stop that. And so when you look at the university, there is a manifest and latent function of Black studies. The manifest is mainly how it adapts to the institutional norms. In other words, students have to take courses, faculty have to publish or perish, et cetera. So that struggle goes on. But the latent function is the more radical one. And that is every time something happens, like George Floyd, like the police murders, like Katrina, like all kinds of things, what happens is a spontaneous motion occurs, a spontaneous resistance occurs. And that's because the objective reality grabs people, and especially young people, but eventually everybody. Now, of course, we have a real problem. The problem is spontaneity doesn't last very long. In other words, it happens, there's demonstrations, et cetera, and then eventually it subsides. And so I think what we're facing out of the current Black Lives Matter moment is whether or not there is cadre development. That is an understanding of the movement and its rise and fall and its pitfalls and its struggles within itself, to the development of individuals who will sustain their involvement. This happened at every stage of a spontaneous movement. There were cadre that were developed that then get involved in the long march. They continue the work. That phrase, the long march through the institutions. Many people from the Black Power period and all those movements I talked about went into Black studies. And they continued to develop. And so there were study groups, there were reading groups, et cetera, so the radical Black tradition continues, even within the context of the more conservative institutions. It's still there and it's still alive. Now, your point about time and the individual, the truth of the matter is that there's limited work we can do as individuals. We have to collectively work together. And this technology enables us to do that even more than we could have done before. I'll give you an example. Many of us have been students of Malcolm X. So we founded a group called the Malcolm X Working Group. And out of that group came Bill Sales and his book, which deals with the OAAU, James Cone and his book that dealt with King and Malcolm, Preston Wilcox, who founded Malcolm X Lovers Network. And he was the great archivist of Harlem. And so all the leaflets and programs and activity around Malcolm that came out of Harlem, he collected all of that. And of course, I developed a website on Malcolm. And hopefully in the future, that will be another book that I've been working on for many decades. But collectively, our task is to, as individuals, is to find some other people who are interested in what we're interested in and work together. I mean, that is absolutely critical. That's what they had at these HBCUs. There was a collective of people who you were interacting with. That's what we can have in our Black Studies departments. Because the necessity of listening to each other and learning from each other is really the lifeblood and the energy that we need to capture in Black Studies departments and not let people get disillusioned by thinking that no one's interested in their work. We have to be interested in each other's work. And your last point about language, my God, I'm so waiting for the computer scientists to work this out, so we can talk in our own language and we can hear each other because we are in these language prisons. I mean, in doing the diaspora studies, I looked at 11 countries. And, I'm trapped in what little I know about, okay, I know a little French, I know a little German, but, I don't know Portuguese. And but here I am writing about Brazil, so I'm like skimming off the top of what can be discerned from the translated literature. But you're absolutely right. That the deep probe into each of our experiences, and Ngugi Watiango is really helping us and reminding us that the indigenous languages are fundamental to understanding the African experience and all of our dialects and all of our ways of thinking, cross genders, cross all these different ways of understanding. That word epistemology comes in here. So you're absolutely right. And now in Canada, you've got other languages up in there, particularly French, but, other particularly indigenous languages. And all I can say is I'm right with you, sister. I mean, what can we do? Maybe somebody here has some ideas, but we need to do something on that question.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. I think we have a question, intervention, comment from Terry.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I'm a little, how do I put this? I feel as if some of the terrain of what I was going to ask has already been covered. So I'm going to pivot a little bit, and maybe it's just an addition into this conversation. But one thing that really struck me is that you mentioned the McCarthy era as this moment where we get the freedom movement as this kind of wellspring of momentum towards, of course, the Black Power movement and moving forward. And this is where we start to get an establishment of Black studies. And I was curious about that because I feel as if with the CRT panic that's certainly gripping the United States, but is increasingly starting to come forth in policy discourses in Canada. We're seeing folks in Alberta, for example, start to use some of these weaponized discourses against really Black scholarship. I'm curious about how we guard against and flourish despite these dynamics within Black studies, right? So thinking not just about, creating defensive resources, but also thinking about how we mobilize to create different futures, despite and perhaps in relation to some of those dynamics. And then that also got me thinking a bit about disciplining and interdisciplinarity, right? So the university itself tries to force us to play particular roles. And I think that as these discourses evolve, I'm concerned that what they'll do is that they'll target interdisciplinary work within Black studies in particular, right? Because then there's the financial imperative as well as this kind of political and discursive imperative to erase Black scholarship and erase Black people. And so, again, I'm curious to know your thoughts about pathways you see forward. But I know that's a bit jumbled, but I really appreciate your insights.
Yeah, no, I mean, we face some real dangers here. In the 60s, people wrote books like Who Needs the Negro? Or The Choice. And he wasn't talking about our choice, he was talking about somebody else's choice, about whether we were going to be useful. But of course, now what we're doing is we're facing the new technologies that are decreasing the demand for the kind of labor that Black people were providing. And so we're really entering into a period where Black people become essentially marginalized in a fundamental way more than ever before, going all the way back to slavery when our labor was fundamental to the development of the economy. So we're really in a fix. And yet, on the other hand, the demographic shift in the United States, where it's becoming a Black and brown country, has these white people in the right wing in a serious panic. And so this fascist development is occurring in direct response to this possibility, not that Black people are aware of it, but that they're going to be aware of it as they historically develop demographically. But you raise a very interesting point about the future. And it seems to me that what we have to do is, as intellectuals, we have to really become much more humble about our role. It's really the role of the people, and it's a role of social movements that's going to impact the future. And therefore, our position is, how do we position ourselves in relationship to that? Not how do I position ourselves as the future leaders of whoever we want to sort of anoint as the social force that can bring about change. And so what I would say, for example, in the United States today, with as much dark as we can see, there's also bright lights developing. I think the organizing efforts at Amazon and Starbucks, for example, really represent what we're really talking about here are Black workers. We're talking about what in the United States would be called immigrant workers, who are becoming the vanguard of a new stage of development. And the question is, how do we position ourselves in relationship to that kind of development? Or even, again, Sankofa, trying to go back and try to understand the relationship, for example, within art. What was the contradiction with the development of public art, of the murals? And how do we begin to think about how the community can be educated and exposed to the new ideas so that they can then develop the next stage of ideas? The creativity of the future is going to come from our community. And we have to constantly put back our resources into that community. One of the interesting things that used to happen is that fraternal organizations in the Black community used to have all kinds of contests and so on, people reciting poetry, people reading speeches, memorizing speeches and performing them in front of audiences, etc. We have to figure out ways to bring our institutionalization out of the campus into the community. And that, so for example, churches. Now look, some people are very religious and a whole lot of people are not very religious. But let's look at churches as both religious institutions and as community institutions. Because again, that's where our people are. And that's where we have to be. And so one of the cultural activities on most campuses in the United States is a gospel choir. Not to have a church service, but because that's an expression of culture that not only involves fundamentally something, music, but it involves a lot of people. And so you can have a lot of people engaged. So we have to figure out a way to, and patience is important as well. Because one of the things that we do in the campus is, the semester is so long, students are only around for 4 years, and it's got to be done within those really limited timeframes. And we have to really have a different sense of patience and investment in our communities. And the other thing, of course, the last point I want to make about the future is the fact that if we can help people understand it's been done in the past, that helps people understand we can do it again. I mean, we did have slavery, let's remember that, and a whole lot of Black people had to escape and get to Canada, but we ended that. Okay, we ended up with what we had, and there was a Ku Klux Klan and there was lynching, and we ended that. And we got so aluta continua. But whatever we got, we can end and then get ready for the next one, is what we really have to do. And Black Studies is where that lesson can be developed and preserved and celebrated. We have to become cadre is basically what I'm saying.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's really great. And it's also a lovely way to link back to Vanessa's comment around translation, right? So if we think about not just translation between linguistic communities, but also translation between how music, how the creative manipulation of language moves from sacred spaces to secular to profane ones, is another really interesting way to think about the politics of translation and the ethics of translation too.
Yeah.
Were there other questions or reflections that people would like to share? I know that I want to ask Abdul to nominate a piece of music for us to fade out to as well. And also just think about what music, and so maybe one last question after Jennifer's will be just to ask, get ready, Abdul, is what are you currently listening to and what are you currently reading? But we'll take Jennifer's question first.
Hi, thank you so much for this really incredible discussion, and I'm really grateful for the work that you've been doing, and for the foundation that you have laid for us. I've been writing about theories of justice, Black sexual ethics, and Black queer theory, and been doing this while asserting Maatian ethical principles as an alternative starting point to think about these matters. But of course, I've found that my conversation partners like Karenga Diop and Dr. Ben are quite homophobic, simply put. I mean, I was really impressed with the fact that the text that we looked at, in it, you acknowledge and give voice to all of those individuals and to their contributions, and Karenga especially with respect to Maat, while at the same time acknowledging Black queer studies as a part of who we are. I'm interested in just understanding a little bit better how you think about that, how you do that, how you hold those things at once in tension. And also if you think that there are other examples of where that kind of intellectual diversity needs to be honored within Black studies. So I'm offering that as one example of a kind of tension, if you will. But I'm interested in knowing how you handle that, but also in what others there might be, and how you would suggest that we address those.
Yeah, one of the things that happened in my generational experience is that we had a lot of debates. I mean, at one point, the debate was about how to spell the word Africa. Was it a C or a K? And I mean, it got serious. I mean, these were the ideological struggles that people thought were about right and wrong. And one of the things that occurred to us is that, aside from these ideas, there were people who were trying to say, well, you're not in it because you believe X, Y, or Z. And yet there you were. And so if you look at then our tradition, you look at our church, you look at our community, the tradition has always been inclusivity. Even integrated couples, Black and white, could go to the Black church, could go, in other words, the community was also always welcoming. And the gay thing, I mean, the choir director, and, there's these stereotypes, but I mean, everybody knew everything, and everybody was embraced, you know what I mean? And maybe you didn't talk about it, but that's the way it was. We weren't writing people out. We were including people in. I mean, even, sisters having a child out of wedlock, you know what I mean? She might be put out of the church one Sunday, and the next Sunday have a celebration, welcoming her back. You know, I mean, there are ways in which survival required unity, you know, and so the idea that you could actually say somebody's not in Black studies, they thought they were in Black studies, they're talking about Black people, you know, how are you going to put them out? You know, what right do you have to put anybody out of anything? So the task was always, how do you figure how to be inclusive? And so that we developed this idea of a paradigm of unity, where the issue was not how to get people to unite as much as it's how to get people to understand each other without having the kind of polemic that would lead to, I'm not even going to listen to them, I'm not going to read anything they write, I'm going to say ignorance is better than knowledge. And so the question then becomes, if we can actually learn from each other, wow. I mean, so, you know, because let me not try to put myself on any kind of high horse, because I was part of that, you know, not agreeing with people. I was involved in some serious polemical struggles, some of which were in the book. But the point is that we end up needing each other. When I grew up and you were walking down the street and you saw somebody Black, you had never seen him before. There'd be an acknowledgement. Hey, what's up? You know, why? Because we knew we really could need each other any moment. So now today on campus, I was walking, I saw a young sister and I nodded at her. She said, get away from me. Well, okay, she doesn't understand that, but at historic moments like the George Floyd, people will discover calling each other brother and sister again. That's always a possibility. That's always a latent dynamic that comes into play. So I very much understand the point you're making about the necessity to overcome these polarities and these differences, et cetera. And yet there is a struggle over what is the main thing. In other words, everybody's got a problem, everybody's got issues, but it's always interesting when people think their issue is the main issue. And what we have to do as Black studies is constantly interrogate the question, what are the main problems faced by Black people? This raises the whole question of capitalism. This raises the whole question of all those forms and structures of oppression, whether it's racism or patriarchy or homophobia or the environmental crisis. We have to have all of those constantly involved in our discussion. Right now, my current study is I'm looking at the environment and I'm looking at inequality. And so in the southern city, I just came from a month doing interviewing in a small Texas town called Beaumont, Texas, which is one of the great centers of the petrochemical industry in the country. And so here we have people who are living under the threat of this extreme weather and cancer and all kinds of issues. The working class is split between people who are working in the refinery who are making $50 an hour versus people in town who are trying to work at McDonald's and trying to get $15 an hour. They don't see themselves as part of the same class. The town is the blackest and brownest town in Texas. So the question is, under the conditions of this extreme weather, et cetera, can we see a democratic process to overcome what contradictions? Because everybody knows the hurricanes are coming and everybody knows everybody's vulnerable. So I'm trying to look at Beaumont as a biopsy of the whole country's future. We as Black studies have to understand our task is all Black people, is understanding all Black people and understanding the contradictions, because those contradictions are going to heighten. We haven't seen the worst of it yet. And so we have a real role to play in how the future is going to develop, but it's not in the lead, it's in the assistance of the people who are going to have to fight back. And so, should we all support gay liberation? Of course. Should we all support the end of patriarchy? Of course. But in any given local community, the mix of forces that are in play and what contradictions are going to be the ones that lead to a movement developing, that's where we have to have this nuanced understanding of how the movement will develop. It'll be different in different places, but together it has to converge around broader understandings of how we can transform the very societies we're in. So that's what I'm looking at right now: environment, the climate crisis, and extreme weather. Now you asked some interesting questions. What am I listening to? First of all, I edit a list called Abdul's List. I don't know if anybody, are you on Abdul's list? Anybody? Yeah, Dan is on it. Send me email. I want y'all's email. I'm put you on, because I send it out every week. And the last one I sent out was on the contributions of Chicago to our music. The next post is going to be the contributions of New York to our music: gospel, blues, jazz, rap, special category, But what I've been listening to recently is a childhood friend of mine that I grew up with. I don't know if you all know this name, Terry Collier, Callier. That will be a treat for you. Terry, Terry, Collier, Callier. And what I've been reading, I just finished Martin Kielson's. Martin Kielson was the first Black tenured professor at Harvard in political science. And he's quite a character. Anyway, I just finished this book, and I've been recently engaged in rereading Octavia Butler's parable books, Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents. I guess if I was going to be a religious person, I'd be with Earthseed, But the way I read Earthseed is I replace the word God with the word history. So when she says God has changed, history has changed. Learn from God, learn from history. So think about that. But no, I mean, Octavia Butler, wow. And then of course, Walter Mosley. I mean, if you haven't read Walter Mosley, when you discovered people like that, I mean, because I had stopped reading novels, and poetry. I don't know, how you change different times, but I mean, you discover things, and oh my God, whew, buddy, you learn about, you learn about people, you learn about life. It's really, that's the thing about Black Studies is we need to really get people into the music. How you going to understand anything you're not into the music? And then the literature, the novels, and it's like the food, I mean, yeah. I don't know about you all, but I'm having fun,
How are people feeling? Would it be helpful if we played a little bit of music as a break? How do people feel like continuing the conversation? We could play a little bit.
Play African Violet by
Okay.
Terry Collier.
African violet, ain't you through dreaming yet? With all your roots so deep, why are you still asleep? Afro-American, I tell you like a friend. Try to remember, my dear, we're only pilgrims here. Heart is in Zimbabwe, because my friends are there. Yes, the heart is in Zimbabwe, because my friends are there. African violet, sometimes your eyes are wet. So many dreams you keep, oh, so many tears you weep. Afro-American, I tell you once again, try to remember, my dear, we're only pilgrims here.
Heart is in Zimbabwe, because my friends are there. My heart is in Zimbabwe, because my friends are there.
when all the trials are done, you'll see the rising sun. Afro-American, I tell you once again, try to remember, my dear, we're only strangers here.
Heart is in Zimbabwe because my friends are there. My heart is in Zimbabwe because my friends are there.
Once again, just have a little bit of space, not just to thank Abdul for sharing such critical knowledge, but for the stimulating engagement with personal experience and theory, and for such a reminder that to be serious is not to be dull, right? Is to engage with playfulness, is to engage with the seriousness of comedy, of music, of laughter, of joy. And I think Lewis Gordon is cited beautifully in this text. And one of the things Lewis always reminds us of is that critical injunction to wish each other health, wish each other safety, and also wish each other joy. And I really wish that to you, Abdul, and thank you for sharing so much of yourself, what you've struggled with and against within yourself and within different movements, how you've invited us to think about intergenerational communication, diversity within Blackness, how we approach disagreements as a sign of love and collegiality, and how can we do that when social media says we should be in different camps, or that we should be shouting at each other, right? Cultivating these spaces for us to reflect is so beautiful. So I'm putting in the chat, the Terry Callier piece, and if we do put this up as a recording, we'll maybe have a nice seamless outro into just a magical troubadour who was often under-recognized during his lifetime. Yeah, thank you. Were there any last words or thoughts or reflections you'd like to share?
Thank you.
No.
Thank you for an engaging discussion. I enjoyed myself. Good.
Thanks so much. Thanks, everyone.